Listen carefully. I just connected with millions of young people worldwide who reject your system, and from the ashes of your failed promises rises a global movement you cannot stop. You believed your universities would brainwash us forever, your media would control our thinking endlessly, your debt traps would keep us obedient while we stayed divided and hopeless. You were wrong. I united global youth. Your shock shows, your control breaks, and your generation is finished. Let me show you exactly how I discovered that youth everywhere face the same enemy and fight the same battle for dignity and future. I was reading messages on social media when I started noticing a pattern. Young people from America, Europe, Asia, and Africa were all expressing identical frustrations. They couldn't afford housing. They couldn't find good jobs. They couldn't pay their debts. They couldn't see any future. They all felt betrayed by the system their parents built. I investigated these complaints carefully and found they came from the same root cause. The older generation had created economic systems that enriched themselves while destroying opportunities for young people. They bought houses cheap and watched prices rise. They got free education and then made it expensive. They had stable jobs and then created temporary work. They built wealth and then crashed the economy. The pattern was global and identical. In America, young people couldn't afford homes because older generations bought everything and raised prices. In Europe, youth couldn't find work because companies preferred temporary contracts. In Asia, students drowned in debt because education became expensive business. In Africa, we faced all these problems, plus continued colonial extraction. I calculated the wealth transfer from young to old precisely. In America, the average person over 65 had net worth of $240,000. The average person under 35 had net worth of $13,600. The older generation was 18 times wealthier than the younger generation. This gap came from deliberate policies that helped old people and hurt young people. Older generations bought houses when prices were low. Then they blocked new housing construction to make their properties more valuable. Housing prices increased 600% over 40 years. Young people now paid 18 times more for the same houses their parents bought cheap. The theft was systematic and enormous. If housing prices had stayed at the same ratio to income, young Americans would pay average $120,000 for starter homes. Instead, they paid average $430,000. The difference, $310,000 per young buyer, was wealth transferred from youth to older property owners. Over 20 years, approximately 35 million young Americans bought overpriced homes. Multiply by $310,000 stolen from each buyer. That equals $10,850 billion transferred from young people to old people through housing price manipulation alone. But housing was just one mechanism of generational theft. Education debt was another massive transfer of wealth from young to old. I studied American university costs and found shocking increases. In 1980, average public university cost $2,500 yearly. By 2025, the same education cost $28,000 yearly. The price increased 11 times faster than inflation. Education became a debt trap instead of an opportunity. This explosion in costs came from deliberate decisions by older generations. They cut public funding for universities after they finished their own free educations. They allowed administrators to multiply and raise salaries. They permitted universities to build luxury facilities. They created a system where young people paid enormous prices for education that older generations received cheaply or free. The debt burden was crushing. Average American student graduated with $37,000 in debt. This debt charged 6% interest yearly. Over 20 years of repayment, students paid total $63,000, nearly double the original loan. The interest payments were pure wealth transfer from young workers to old lenders. I calculated the total generational theft through student debt. Approximately 45 million Americans carried student loans totaling $1.7 trillion. Over the repayment period, they would pay approximately $2.9 trillion including interest. The $1.2 trillion in interest payments was wealth transferred from young people to old lenders. Combined with housing theft, older generations were extracting approximately $12 trillion from young people through just these two mechanisms. This was the largest generational wealth transfer in human history. The older generation was systematically robbing the younger generation. But the theft extended beyond housing and education. The job market was another mechanism for transferring wealth from young to old. I investigated employment patterns and found that older generations had stable careers with pensions and benefits. They worked for one company for decades. They received regular raises and promotions. They retired with guaranteed income. They built wealth through stable employment. Young people faced completely different conditions. Companies eliminated permanent positions and created temporary contracts. They stopped offering pensions and reduced benefits. They kept wages low and blocked promotions. They made employment unstable and insecure. They prevented young workers from building wealth the way older generations had. The contrast was stark and deliberate. Older generations created stable employment for themselves. Then they destroyed that stability for young people to increase corporate profits. They benefited from the old system. They dismantled it after they were secure. They pulled the ladder up behind them. I calculated the cost to young workers. If employment conditions had remained like they were in 1980, young workers would earn average $68,000 yearly with benefits and pensions. Instead, they earned average $43,000 with minimal benefits and no pensions. The difference, $25,000 yearly per young worker, was wealth transferred from youth to corporate owners who were predominantly old. With approximately 70 million young workers in America, this represented $1,750 billion stolen yearly from young people through degraded employment conditions. Over 20 years, that's $35 trillion in generational theft through job market manipulation. Adding housing, education, and employment theft together, older generations were extracting approximately $47 trillion from young people over 20 years. This was wealth that young people earned through their work but never received because the system was designed to transfer it to older generations. The same pattern existed globally with local variations. European youth faced similar housing costs, education debt, and job insecurity. Asian young people dealt with identical wealth extraction mechanisms. African youth suffered all these problems plus continued colonial theft. The generational robbery was worldwide and systematic. I recognized that young people everywhere shared the same enemy. We were all being robbed by older generations who built systems that enriched themselves and impoverished us. We were all facing destroyed futures because the people before us took everything and left nothing. We were all angry about the same betrayal. This recognition created opportunity for global youth movement. If young people everywhere faced the same enemy and the same theft, we could unite across borders to fight back together. We could build international resistance that was stronger than any national movement. We could create worldwide solidarity based on shared experience of generational robbery. I started reaching out to youth movements in other countries deliberately. I sent messages to student protesters in France who were fighting pension reforms that helped old people at young people's expense. I contacted housing activists in Britain who were demanding affordable homes that older generations blocked. I connected with debt strikers in America who refused to pay student loans that older generations created. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Young people everywhere recognized that we faced the same struggle. They understood that my fight against French colonialism in Burkina Faso was part of the same battle they were fighting against generational theft in their own countries. They saw that we were all resisting systems designed to rob youth and enrich old. Listen carefully, Macron and Biden and all old leaders. Remember when you believed young people were divided by borders? Remember when you assumed we wouldn't recognize our common enemy? Remember when you thought generational theft would continue forever? I destroyed every assumption. I united global youth. I exposed your robbery. I built worldwide resistance. Your division tactics failed. Your theft system collapsed. Your control over youth is broken. I organized the first global youth summit in Ouagadougou to formalize our international movement. I invited young activists from 50 countries to discuss our shared struggles and coordinate our resistance. Over 300 youth leaders attended, representing every continent and every major resistance movement. The summit revealed the universal nature of our struggle. French students described fighting pension reforms that transferred wealth from young workers to old retirees. American activists explained resisting student debt that enriched old lenders. British organizers detailed battling housing costs that benefited old property owners. Japanese youth discussed opposing employment systems that favored old workers. Indian representatives outlined challenging family structures that empowered old generations. Every story was different in details but identical in pattern. Older generations had built systems that extracted wealth from young people. They justified this theft through various cultural and economic arguments. But the reality was always the same: old people taking from young people through rigged systems. We identified the common mechanisms of generational theft across all countries. Housing price manipulation was universal. Education debt extraction was widespread. Employment degradation was global. Pension systems favored old over young everywhere. Environmental destruction stole young people's future worldwide. The theft mechanisms were remarkably similar despite cultural differences. We also recognized the common propaganda that older generations used to justify their robbery. They claimed young people were lazy and entitled. They insisted the theft was natural market forces. They argued that young people just needed to work harder. They blamed victims for the poverty that old people's systems created. This propaganda was identical globally. American old people said young Americans were lazy. French old people claimed young French were entitled. Japanese old people insisted young Japanese were weak. African old people argued young Africans were spoiled. The accusations were the same everywhere because they served the same purpose, justifying generational theft. We decided at the summit to build coordinated global youth resistance. We would share strategies that worked in different countries. We would support each other's movements with resources and publicity. We would create international pressure that was stronger than any national government could resist. We would unite young people worldwide against the old people robbing us. The coordination started immediately. When French students organized protests against pension reforms, youth movements in 20 countries held solidarity demonstrations. When American activists launched debt strikes, young people globally refused to pay unjust debts in their own countries. When British housing campaigners occupied empty buildings, youth worldwide copied the tactic. The international coordination multiplied our power enormously. Older generations could ignore protests in one country. They couldn't ignore simultaneous protests in 50 countries. They could suppress one movement. They couldn't suppress a global uprising. They could control national media. They couldn't control international youth solidarity. I watched the movement grow with satisfaction and hope. Within 1 year of the summit, coordinated youth actions were happening monthly. Within 2 years, they were happening weekly. Within 3 years, they were constant and everywhere. We had built a permanent global youth resistance that older generations couldn't stop. But the movement was not just about protests and demonstrations. We were also building alternative systems that served young people instead of robbing them. I shared Burkina Faso's model of youth-focused development. We had created programs that gave young people land to farm. We established training systems that taught useful skills without debt. We built housing cooperatives that provided affordable homes. We designed employment programs that offered stable work. We created systems that helped youth instead of extracting from them. Young activists in other countries copied and adapted these models. French youth established farming cooperatives that gave them land access. American students created debt-free education alternatives. British activists formed housing cooperatives that bypassed expensive markets. Japanese young people built worker cooperatives that provided stable employment. Each alternative system was small initially, but they demonstrated that different approaches were possible. They proved that systems could serve young people instead of robbing them. They showed that we didn't need to accept the theft that older generations insisted was inevitable. I calculated the potential impact if these alternatives spread widely. If 10% of young people globally participated in alternative systems, that would be approximately 200 million people building new economic structures. This would create enormous pressure on traditional systems to reform or become irrelevant. The alternative systems also provided practical benefits immediately. Young people in cooperatives had affordable housing. Students in alternative education avoided debt. Workers in cooperative businesses had stable employment. The alternatives delivered real improvements in young people's lives while building resistance to generational theft. But older generations fought back against our movement viciously. They used every weapon to stop global youth resistance. They deployed police to attack protesters. They arrested movement leaders. They infiltrated organizations with spies. They spread propaganda claiming young people were violent and dangerous. They used media to discredit our demands. They employed every tactic to crush youth resistance. I experienced this repression personally. Western intelligence agencies tried to assassinate me twice because my movement inspired global youth resistance. They attempted to isolate Burkina Faso economically to make our youth-focused model fail. They spread lies about our programs to discourage other countries from copying them. But the repression backfired by proving our analysis was correct. If older generations weren't robbing young people, why did they fight so hard to stop us from building alternatives? If the system was fair, Why did they attack us for demanding change? If generational theft wasn't real, why were they so desperate to prevent young people from uniting globally? The repression actually strengthened our movement by radicalizing more young people. Each arrested protester created 10 more activists. Each police attack generated 100 more supporters. Each propaganda lie convinced 1,000 more youth that the system was corrupt. The violence exposed the truth we were speaking. I studied how previous youth movements had been defeated and learned from their mistakes. The 1960s generation had been co-opted through offering them positions in the system they opposed. They started as radicals and ended as the old people robbing the next generation. We needed to avoid this trap. I implemented strict principles to prevent co-optation. Movement leaders could not accept positions in governments or corporations. Activists who took such positions were expelled from the movement. We refused all offers to join the system we were fighting. We maintained absolute commitment to replacing the system, not reforming it. This discipline was essential because older generations constantly tried to buy off our leaders. They offered prestigious jobs, money, maybe an influence to activists who would stop organizing resistance. They wanted to divide us by elevating some individuals while leaving the movement behind. We rejected every offer because we understood the trap. Individual success within the system meant abandoning the collective struggle. Getting a good job for yourself meant accepting that most young people would never have opportunities. Joining the system meant betraying the movement that gave you a platform. I watched several prominent youth activists in Western countries accept such offers and abandon their movements. They justified their decisions by claiming they could change the system from inside. But they never changed anything. They just became part of the system, robbing the next generation of young people. We learned from these failures and built a movement that couldn't be bought. We created collective leadership instead of individual stars. We rotated positions to prevent anyone from becoming too important. We shared resources equally instead of rewarding leaders. We built a structure that served the movement instead of individuals. The discipline made our movement much stronger and more sustainable. We didn't lose activists to co-optation. We didn't fracture over personality conflicts. We didn't collapse when leaders were arrested or killed. We built permanent resistance that would continue regardless of what happened to any individual. But we also recognized that protest and alternatives alone wouldn't defeat generational theft. We needed political power to change the systems that enabled robbery of young people. We needed to take control of governments and implement policies that served youth instead of old. I studied how to build political power for young people. The traditional approach was working within existing political parties. But this rarely worked because parties were controlled by old people who defended generational theft. Young politicians who joined these parties either accepted the theft or were blocked from power. We needed a different approach. We needed to build independent youth political movements that refused to compromise with older generations. We needed to take power directly instead of asking permission from the people robbing us. I encouraged young activists globally to form independent political organizations. These would not be traditional parties that sought to work within existing systems. They would be revolutionary movements that sought to replace existing systems with ones that served young people. Several countries saw the emergence of such movements. In France, young activists formed a political organization demanding wealth redistribution from old to young. In America, youth created a movement calling for debt cancellation and free education. In Britain, young people established a party demanding housing reform and wealth taxes on old property owners. These movements were explicitly generational in their politics. They identified old people as the enemy. They demanded wealth transfer from old to young. They promised to govern for youth interests exclusively. They rejected the idea that all generations should compromise. They insisted that young people deserved to take back what had been stolen. The explicit generational conflict was controversial but necessary. Older generations had been waging generational war against young people for decades. They had systematically transferred wealth from young to old. They had destroyed opportunities and futures. They had stolen everything. Pretending this wasn't happening only helped the thieves. Calling for compromise only preserved the theft. Being polite only enabled continued robbery. We needed to name the enemy clearly and fight back without apology. I calculated the political math. In most countries, young people under 40 were approximately 45% of the population. If we voted as a bloc for youth interests, we could win elections and take power. We had the numbers. We just needed the organization and the will. The challenge was that young people historically voted at lower rates than old people. In America, only 38% of people under 30 voted, compared to 71% of people over 65. This voting gap gave old people disproportionate political power despite being a smaller population. We needed to change this pattern by making young people understand that voting was essential for stopping generational theft. We organized massive voter registration campaigns. We educated youth about the stakes of elections. We built transportation systems to get young people to polls. We treated voting as a form of resistance against old people's robbery. The results were dramatic. In countries where our movement was strong, youth voting increased by 20 to 30 percentage points. In France's 2027 elections, youth turnout reached 63% compared to historical 42%. In Britain's 2028 elections, young people voted at 67% compared to previous 47%. This increased turnout translated into political victories. Youth-focused parties won significant representation in parliaments. Some countries saw youth movements become the largest opposition parties. A few countries elected youth-majority governments that implemented radical redistribution policies. The political victories enabled real policy changes that helped young people. France implemented wealth taxes on property owners over 55 and used the revenue to fund free education. Britain created mandatory affordable housing requirements and banned investment property ownership. Germany established debt cancellation programs for student loans and made university free again. Each policy victory demonstrated that political power could reverse generational theft. We could take back the wealth that old people had stolen. We could rebuild the opportunities they had destroyed. We could create futures they had tried to deny us. Political power made all this possible. But the most important impact of our global youth movement was psychological and cultural. We were changing how young people saw themselves and their relationship to older generations. For decades, young people had been taught to respect their elders and accept their guidance. We were told that old people were wiser and knew better. We were expected to be grateful for what they gave us and patient about inheriting their wealth eventually. We were raised to be obedient to the generation robbing us. Our movement shattered this psychological submission. We taught young people that old people were not wiser, they were selfish. They didn't know better, they just took more. We shouldn't be grateful, we should be angry. We shouldn't wait patiently, we should take back what was stolen. This psychological shift was revolutionary. Young people stopped accepting generational theft as natural. They recognized it as deliberate robbery. They understood that old people were their enemies, not their guides. They rejected the entire cultural framework that justified their exploitation. I watched this transformation happen in young people across the world. They went from confused and depressed to angry and determined. They stopped blaming themselves for poverty and started blaming the system. They quit trying to succeed within structures designed to exploit them and started building alternatives. They transformed from victims into fighters. The transformation process was gradual but irreversible. Young people would attend our meetings feeling hopeless and defeated. They believed their poverty was their personal failure. They thought they weren't working hard enough or weren't smart enough or weren't lucky enough. They blamed themselves for problems that the system created deliberately. I showed them the mathematics of generational theft. I explained how housing prices were manipulated to transfer wealth from young to old. I demonstrated how education costs were inflated to create profitable debt. I proved how employment conditions were degraded to maximize profits for old owners. I documented the systematic robbery with numbers that couldn't be denied. The realization hit them like physical force. They suddenly understood that their struggles weren't personal failures. The system was designed to keep them poor. Their poverty enriched older generations. Their suffering was deliberate policy, not unfortunate accident. The enemy wasn't themselves. The enemy was the people robbing them. This understanding changed everything. Depression transformed into rage. Self-blame became system blame. Hopelessness shifted to determination. They stopped trying to fix themselves and started trying to destroy the system, exploiting them. They became dangerous to the established order because they recognized the truth. I documented this transformation in thousands of young people. In France, a student named Marie came to our meetings crying about her inability to afford rent. She believed she was failing at life. I showed her that rent consumed 63% of her income because old people owned all the housing and charged whatever they wanted. She stopped crying and started organizing rent strikes. In America, a worker named James attended our gatherings depressed about his inability to save money. He thought he was bad at managing finances. I proved that his wages had stagnated for 20 years while his productivity doubled. The wealth he created was stolen by old executives and shareholders. He stopped being depressed and started organizing his workplace. In Britain, a graduate named Sarah joined our movement, drowning in student debt. She believed she had made poor educational choices. I demonstrated that university costs increased 1,100% while old people paid nothing for their education. She stopped blaming herself and started refusing to pay her loans. Each transformation followed the same pattern. Young people arrived believing their problems were personal. I showed them the problems were systematic. They left understanding they were victims of deliberate theft. They became activists fighting to take back what was stolen. The cultural change was visible everywhere. Music by young artists expressed rage at older generations. Films portrayed old people as villains stealing from youth. Books analyzed generational theft systematically. Art depicted the robbery visually. Youth culture became explicitly anti-old in ways that shocked and terrified older generations. The music transformation was particularly powerful. For decades, popular music had avoided generational conflict. Songs talked about love, partying, and personal struggles. They didn't address the systematic robbery of young people by old people. They maintained the cultural silence that protected generational theft. Our movement changed this completely. Young musicians started writing songs explicitly about generational war. A French rapper named Karim released a track called Boomer Thieves that detailed how old people stole housing wealth from young people. The song went viral with 50 million views in 2 weeks. Young people everywhere recognized the truth in his lyrics. An American punk band called Debt Revolt created an album titled Take It Back that called for violence against the systems robbing young people. Every song attacked a different aspect of generational theft: housing prices, student loans, wage stagnation, environmental destruction. The album sold 3 million copies and inspired protests across America. A British electronic artist named Zara produced music videos showing old people literally eating young people. The imagery was disturbing and explicit. It visualized the reality of generational theft in ways that made old people uncomfortable. The videos were banned from television but spread massively online. This music reached young people who would never attend political meetings or read economic analysis. It spread the message of generational theft through culture. It made resistance cool and popular. It transformed anger into art that inspired millions. Films followed similar patterns. Young directors created movies portraying generational conflict explicitly. A French film called The Last Generation showed young people violently overthrowing old people's government and redistributing wealth. It won awards at film festivals and sparked intense debate. An American movie titled Debt Collectors depicted young people hunting down and punishing the old executives who created the student loan system. The film was controversial but became a massive hit with young audiences who fantasized about similar revenge. A Japanese anime series called Generation War imagined a future where young and old people fought an actual civil war over resources and wealth. The series became a global phenomenon, with young people identifying strongly with the youth characters fighting against old oppressors. These films did more than entertain. They normalized the idea of generational conflict. They made young people comfortable seeing old people as enemies. They prepared youth psychologically for the real struggle we needed to wage. They were cultural weapons in the generational war. Books analyzing generational theft became bestsellers. A British economist wrote The Great Theft: How Baby Boomers Robbed Millennials, that documented with detailed statistics how older generations systematically transferred wealth from young to old. The book sold 5 million copies and became required reading in our movement. An American journalist published Generation Debt: The 50-Year War on Youth, that traced the policy decisions that created generational theft. She showed how old people deliberately destroyed the opportunities they had enjoyed to maximize their own wealth. The book radicalized millions of young readers. A French sociologist released The Gerontocracy: How Old People Control Everything, that analyzed how older generations maintained political and economic power despite being a minority. The book provided strategic analysis for how young people could take power from old people. These books gave our movement intellectual foundation. They provided evidence that couldn't be dismissed as youthful anger or ignorance. They proved with rigorous research that generational theft was real and systematic. They armed us with knowledge to win arguments and convince skeptics. Art depicted the robbery visually in ways that words couldn't capture. Young artists created installations showing mountains of debt, crushing small figures representing youth. They painted murals of old people with bags of money standing on the backs of young people. They sculpted pieces showing young people trapped in cages made of housing costs and student loans. A German artist created a controversial piece showing old people literally feeding on young people's bodies. The sculpture was graphic and disturbing. It visualized the parasitic relationship where old people's wealth came from consuming young people's futures. Museums initially refused to display it. Young people demanded it be shown. The controversy itself spread the message. A Brazilian street artist painted hundreds of murals across cities, showing the wealth gap between generations. Each mural used simple imagery that anyone could understand: old people in mansions, young people in tents, old people with full plates, young people with empty bowls, old people relaxing, young people working multiple jobs. The murals made generational theft visible in public space. An Indian photographer documented young people's living conditions in a series that went viral globally. The photos showed university graduates living in tiny rooms with multiple roommates, young families unable to afford children, workers commuting 3 hours because they couldn't afford housing near jobs. The images made the human cost of generational theft undeniable. Youth culture became explicitly anti-old in ways that shocked and terrified older generations. Young people stopped pretending to respect their elders. They openly mocked old people's selfishness. They celebrated when old politicians died. They expressed hatred for the generation robbing them. The cultural rebellion was total and unapologetic. Social media amplified this cultural shift. Young people created memes mocking old people's hypocrisy. They shared videos of old people complaining about young people while living in houses they bought for $50,000 that were now worth $800,000. They posted screenshots of old people's social media showing expensive vacations funded by wealth extracted from young people. The mockery was cruel and deliberate. We wanted old people to feel uncomfortable. We wanted them to understand that young people hated them. We wanted to destroy the cultural norm that demanded we respect the people robbing us. The disrespect was strategic and necessary. Young people also started openly celebrating when old people died. When wealthy old executives passed away, young people threw parties. When old politicians who blocked reform died, social media filled with celebrations. When baby boomers reached the age where death rates increased, young people joked about how many would die each year. This celebration of death horrified older generations. They called it cruel and inhuman. They insisted it showed young people's moral bankruptcy. They claimed we were monsters for celebrating death. I rejected their outrage completely. They had spent decades destroying our futures. They had stolen our wealth and our opportunities. They had condemned us to lives of poverty and debt. They deserved no sympathy when they finally died and stopped robbing us. Each death was one less thief. Each funeral was a small victory. We celebrated because we had reason to celebrate. The cultural transformation also included rejecting everything associated with older generations. Young people stopped consuming their media. We didn't watch their television shows or read their newspapers. We created our own media that reflected our perspectives and our anger. We stopped following their fashion. Old people's clothing brands lost young customers completely. We created our own styles that deliberately rejected their aesthetics. Our fashion was a form of resistance, visible rejection of their culture. We stopped listening to their advice. When old people told us how to succeed, we ignored them. They had succeeded in a completely different economy. Their advice was useless or actively harmful. We learned from each other instead of from the generation that destroyed our opportunities. We stopped attending their institutions. Young people increasingly rejected traditional universities that charged enormous debt. We created alternative education systems that were free or cheap. We stopped working for their corporations and built our own cooperatives. We stopped participating in their systems and built parallel structures. This cultural rebellion was necessary and healthy. It marked young people's rejection of the psychological colonization that had kept us accepting our exploitation. It demonstrated that we recognized the enemy and refused to pretend everything was fine. It showed that we were ready to fight back with every tool available. The psychological colonization had been comprehensive and subtle. From childhood, we were taught to respect elders. We were told that old people were wise and deserved deference. We were raised to believe that their success came from hard work and smart choices. We were conditioned to accept their authority and their right to wealth. This conditioning made us blame ourselves when we struggled. If old people succeeded through hard work, our poverty must mean we weren't working hard enough. If they built wealth through smart choices, our debt must mean we made bad choices. The psychological colonization turned victims into willing participants in their own exploitation. Breaking this conditioning required showing young people the truth. Old people weren't wiser, they were luckier. They didn't work harder, they worked in an economy that rewarded work. They didn't make smarter choices, they lived in a system that wasn't designed to trap them. Their success came from circumstances, not virtue. Understanding this truth was liberating. Young people stopped feeling guilty about their poverty. They recognized they were victims of systematic theft, not personal failure. They understood that the problem wasn't them, it was the system and the people who built it to rob them. The liberation created energy for resistance. Young people who blamed themselves for poverty were depressed and passive. Young people who understood they were being robbed became angry and active. The psychological shift from self-blame to system blame transformed us from victims into fighters. Older generations responded with outrage and fear. They claimed young people were disrespectful and ungrateful. They insisted we didn't understand how hard they had worked. They argued that attacking them was unfair and divisive. They demanded we respect them despite robbing us. Their outrage revealed their guilt and fear. They knew they had stolen from us. They understood that their wealth came from our poverty. They recognized that we had legitimate grievances. Their angry denials were attempts to maintain the cultural norms that protected their theft. They insisted they had worked hard for their success. This was true but irrelevant. Working hard didn't justify stealing from the next generation. Many thieves work hard at their stealing. Effort doesn't make robbery moral or acceptable. They claimed they didn't understand economics and weren't responsible for the systems that robbed us. This was a lie. They had voted for the politicians who cut education funding. They had supported the policies that destroyed worker protections. They had benefited from housing price increases and opposed new construction. They were directly responsible for the theft. They argued that generational conflict was divisive and harmful. They wanted young people to unite with old people against some other enemy corporations, foreigners, government, anything except themselves. They needed to deflect blame to preserve their stolen wealth. I rejected their demands completely. They deserved no respect. They had stolen our futures. They had destroyed our opportunities. They had taken everything and left us nothing. They had waged generational war against us for decades. Now they were shocked that we were fighting back. The demand for respect was particularly offensive. Respect must be earned. They had earned our contempt through their theft and their lies. They wanted us to respect them while they robbed us. They expected deference while destroying our futures. They demanded we honor the people who were our enemies. I taught young people that we owed old people nothing. Not respect, not gratitude, not patience, not forgiveness. They had declared war on us through their policies. We were simply recognizing the war and fighting back. We were the defenders, not the aggressors. The conflict was open and total now. There was no pretending that generations had common interests. There was no claiming that everyone wanted the same things. There was no suggesting that compromise was possible. The war was explicit and both sides understood it clearly. Young people worldwide were united in demanding wealth redistribution from old to young. We wanted housing prices crashed to affordable levels. We wanted education debt canceled completely. We wanted employment conditions restored to what older generations enjoyed. We wanted environmental destruction stopped before it killed us. We wanted everything taken back from the thieves. The housing demand was non-negotiable. We insisted that housing prices be reduced by 70% to restore historical ratios between housing costs and incomes. This would destroy the wealth of old property owners. We didn't care. They had stolen that wealth from us through price manipulation. Taking it back was justice, not theft. We demanded that multiple property ownership be banned. Old people owned second homes, third homes, investment properties. These extra properties drove up prices and prevented young people from buying first homes. We wanted all extra properties seized and redistributed to young people at affordable prices. We called for property taxes that increased dramatically with age. Young people would pay minimal property taxes. Old people would pay enormous taxes that would force them to sell their overpriced properties. This would redistribute housing wealth from old to young through taxation. The education debt cancellation was equally firm. We demanded that all student loans be forgiven immediately with no repayment. This would cost old lenders trillions in lost interest payments. We didn't care. They had created predatory debt to profit from young people's need for education. Canceling the debt was ending theft, not creating loss. We insisted that all education be free going forward. Universities would be funded through taxes on old people who benefited from free education themselves. They had pulled up the ladder behind them. We would force them to put the ladder back down. We called for prosecution of the old executives and politicians who created the student debt system. They had deliberately designed a system to trap young people in debt. This was criminal behavior that deserved punishment. We wanted them in prison, not retirement. The employment demands focused on restoring conditions that older generations had enjoyed. We wanted permanent jobs with benefits and pensions to replace temporary contracts. We wanted wages that matched productivity increases. We wanted 40-hour work weeks instead of 60-hour weeks. We wanted everything old people had received before they destroyed it for us. We demanded that all temporary contracts be converted to permanent positions immediately. Companies would be forced to provide the job security that older workers had enjoyed. If companies couldn't afford this, they would be nationalized and run as worker cooperatives. We called for minimum wages that matched historical ratios to productivity. If productivity had doubled, wages should double. The wealth that workers created should go to workers, not to old executives and shareholders. This would require massive wealth redistribution from old to young. We insisted on mandatory profit sharing, where workers received 50% of all company profits. Old executives and shareholders had been taking all the gains from productivity increases. We would force them to share the wealth that workers created. The environmental demands were existential. We wanted immediate end to all fossil fuel use. We wanted massive investment in renewable energy. We wanted prosecution of old executives who had known about climate change and lied about it. We wanted our future back from the people who were destroying it for profit. We demanded that old people pay for climate change mitigation and adaptation. They had created the problem. They had profited from the destruction. They would pay to fix it. Young people would not bear the cost of old people's greed. We called for climate reparations where old people's wealth would be seized and used to address climate change. Every dollar they made from fossil fuels would be taken back. Every asset they built through environmental destruction would be redistributed. They would die poor as punishment for destroying our future. Older generations were united in defending their stolen wealth. They wanted housing prices high to protect their property values. They wanted education debt maintained to profit from interest. They wanted employment flexibility to maximize corporate profits. They wanted environmental destruction continued to preserve their lifestyles. They wanted to keep everything they had stolen. Their unity was impressive and revealing. Old people who disagreed about everything else agreed about protecting their wealth from young people. Conservative old people and liberal old people both defended high housing prices. Religious old people and atheist old people both opposed debt cancellation. Old people across all divisions united to preserve their theft from young people. This unity proved that generational conflict was the fundamental division. Race, religion, nationality, ideology, all these divisions were secondary to the generational war. Old people of all backgrounds united to rob young people. Young people of all backgrounds needed to unite to fight back. The conflict was irreconcilable. One side had to win, and the other had to lose. There was no middle ground. There was no compromise that satisfied both. There was only total victory or total defeat. Compromise meant young people accepting permanent poverty while old people kept stolen wealth. It meant we would continue suffering while they continued profiting. It meant we would die poor while they died rich. Compromise was surrender. We rejected it completely. Victory meant taking back everything old people had stolen. It meant crashing housing prices and canceling debts and redistributing wealth. It meant old people dying poor after living rich on stolen money. It meant young people finally getting the opportunities that had been destroyed. Victory was justice. We would accept nothing less. I am the architect of global youth resistance against generational theft. I recognize that young people everywhere face the same enemy. I calculated the scale of wealth transfer from young to old. I organized international coordination of youth movements. I built alternative systems that served young people. I created political organizations that fought for youth interests. I transformed youth culture to reject psychological submission. My work was systematic and comprehensive. I didn't just protest. I built a complete alternative to the system robbing us. I created economic structures that served young people. I established political organizations that fought for our interests. I transformed culture to support resistance. I built a movement that would win the generational war. The economic alternatives provided immediate relief while building long-term power. Young people in our cooperatives had affordable housing, debt-free education, and stable employment. They experienced directly that different systems were possible. They became living proof that we didn't need to accept the theft. The political organizations gave us power to change laws and policies. We elected young people who implemented wealth redistribution. We passed legislation that helped youth at old people's expense. We used government power to take back what was stolen. We proved that political action could reverse generational theft. The cultural transformation prepared young people psychologically for the struggle. We stopped accepting our exploitation as natural. We recognized old people as enemies. We rejected the conditioning that made us blame ourselves. We became fighters ready to take back our futures. Your legacy is $47 trillion stolen from young people through housing, education, and employment theft. Old generation leaders. My legacy is uniting global youth to take back what you stole. The $47 trillion was conservative estimate. It only included direct theft through housing prices, education debt, and wage stagnation. It didn't count environmental destruction that would cost trillions to fix. It didn't include healthcare costs that old people made unaffordable. It didn't measure the psychological damage from decades of exploitation. The true cost was much higher. But even the conservative number was staggering. $47 trillion stolen from one generation by another. This was the largest theft in human history. It was systematic robbery sustained over decades through deliberate policies. It was generational war waged by old against young. My legacy was building the resistance that would reverse this theft. I united young people globally to recognize the enemy and fight back. I provided the analysis, the organization, and the inspiration. I created the movement that would win the generational war and take back our futures. History will remember which generation served humanity's future. The answer is written in the destroyed opportunities, crushing debts, and stolen wealth that you created. You robbed your own children to enrich yourselves. We united globally to stop your theft and build fair systems. The lesson is eternal. The proof is mathematical. The outcome is inevitable. History would judge harshly the generation that stole from its own children. Old people had broken the fundamental human contract that each generation should leave the world better for the next. They had reversed this completely. They left the world worse while taking everything for themselves. Future generations would study this period with horror. They would analyze how one generation could be so selfish and destructive. They would document the mechanisms of theft. They would calculate the costs. They would condemn the perpetrators. History would remember old people as thieves and villains, but history would also remember the young people who fought back. We would be celebrated as the generation that refused to accept our exploitation. We would be honored for building the resistance that defeated generational theft. We would be remembered as the fighters who took back our futures. The lesson was eternal because generational theft would always be tempting. Every generation would be tempted to take more for themselves and leave less for their children. Our struggle would teach future generations to resist this temptation. Our victory would prove that theft could be defeated. Our example would inspire eternal vigilance against generational robbery. The proof was mathematical because numbers didn't lie. $47 trillion stolen, housing prices up 600%, education costs up 1,100%. Wages stagnant for 40 years. The theft was documented precisely. The evidence was overwhelming. The mathematics proved everything. The outcome was inevitable because demographics guaranteed our victory. Old people were dying. Young people were growing in numbers and power. Time was on our side. Eventually, we would have the votes and the strength to take back everything. The generational war would end with youth victory because mathematics and mortality guaranteed it. Global youth resistance is rising everywhere. We are coordinating across borders. We are building alternatives. We are taking political power. We are rejecting your cultural control. We are demanding everything back. The movement cannot be stopped because we are the future and you are the past. Your time is ending. Our time is beginning. The generational war is open. The youth will win. The mathematics guarantee it. The rise was visible everywhere. Youth movements were growing in every country. Protests were larger and more frequent. Alternative institutions were multiplying. Political victories were accumulating. Cultural rebellion was intensifying. The momentum was with us and accelerating. The coordination across borders made us stronger than any national movement. When old people suppressed youth resistance in one country, we responded with protests in 50 countries. When they arrested our leaders in one place, we elevated new leaders everywhere. When they tried to divide us by nationality, we united globally by generation. The international solidarity was our greatest strength. The alternatives we built provided foundation for victory. We didn't just protest the old system, we created new systems that worked better. We proved that young people could govern ourselves. We demonstrated that our solutions were superior. We built the future while fighting the past. The political power we were taking would allow us to implement our demands. We would crash housing prices through law. We would cancel debts through government action. We would redistribute wealth through taxation. We would reverse generational theft through democratic power. The votes were coming. The victory was certain. The cultural transformation ensured the movement would continue. Young people were raised understanding generational theft. They learned from birth that old people were their enemies. They grew up ready to fight. Each new generation would be more radical than the last. The resistance would intensify until we won completely. We were the future. They were the past. This simple fact guaranteed our ultimate victory. They would die. We would live. They would lose power through age. We would gain power through numbers. Time itself was our weapon. We just needed to survive and organize until demographics delivered victory. I calculated the demographic mathematics precisely. The average age of people in our youth movement was 27 years old. The average age of people defending the current system was 63 years old. This 36-year age gap meant we would outlive them by decades. Every year that passed, thousands of old people died while thousands of young people joined our movement. The mortality rates proved our inevitable victory. People aged 63 had approximately 22 years of life remaining on average. People aged 27 had approximately 54 years remaining. We had 32 more years to fight than they did. Time was crushing them while strengthening us. I studied historical examples of how demographic change determined political outcomes. Every revolutionary movement that had youth support eventually won because young people outlived their opponents. The old guard could suppress youth movements temporarily through violence and repression, but they couldn't stop time from killing them and empowering their enemies. The civil rights movement succeeded partly because young people sustained the struggle for decades while old segregationists died. The anti-colonial movements won because young independence fighters outlasted old colonial administrators. The democratic movements triumphed because young activists survived longer than old dictators. Time delivered victory to youth movements throughout history. Our generational war would follow the same pattern. Old people could block our reforms today. They could defend their stolen wealth temporarily. They could use their current political power to resist redistribution. But they couldn't stop themselves from aging and dying. They couldn't prevent young people from growing in numbers and strength. They couldn't defeat time itself. I projected the demographic shift forward. In 2030, people over 60 would still outnumber people under 30 in most Western countries. But by 2040, the ratio would flip. By 2050, young people would dominate completely as the baby boom generation died off. The political power would shift automatically through demographics. This shift meant we didn't need to win every battle today. We just needed to survive and organize until time delivered victory. Every year that passed weakened our enemies and strengthened us. Every election brought us closer to majority power. Every death removed an opponent. Every birth added a potential ally. The patience this required was difficult but necessary. Young people wanted immediate change. We were suffering under generational theft right now. We wanted justice immediately, not in 20 years. But understanding the demographic mathematics gave us confidence that victory was inevitable even if delayed. I taught young activists to think in decades, not years. We were building a movement that would win eventually through sheer demographic force. We needed to maintain our organization and our anger until time delivered the numbers we needed. We needed to survive the current struggle and prepare for the future victory. The survival strategy was crucial. Old people wanted us to give up and accept our exploitation. They wanted us to become discouraged and stop fighting. They wanted our movement to fade as young people aged and became invested in the current system. They needed us to surrender before demographics shifted power to us. We refused to surrender because we understood the mathematics. We knew victory was coming. We just needed to maintain resistance until time brought it. We needed to keep organizing, keep protesting, keep building alternatives. We needed to survive as a movement until demographics delivered political power. The organization we built was designed for long-term struggle. We created structures that would outlast any individual leader. We trained multiple generations of activists. We documented our analysis and strategies so they could be passed down. We built a movement that would continue fighting for decades until victory came. We also recognized that our struggle would benefit future generations more than ourselves. Many of us would spend our entire lives fighting without seeing complete victory. We would suffer under generational theft while organizing the resistance that would eventually defeat it. We would sacrifice for young people who weren't born yet. This sacrifice was necessary and honorable. Every generation that fought weakened our enemies and strengthened our movement. Every year of resistance made eventual victory more certain. We were building momentum that would culminate in triumph even if we personally didn't live to see it. But we also understood that partial victories were possible before complete triumph. As demographics shifted gradually, we would gain increasing political power. We could implement some reforms before achieving total victory. We could win battles even while the war continued. I projected these partial victories. By 2030, we would have enough votes to cancel some student debt and crash some housing prices. By 2040, we would control enough governments to implement major wealth redistribution. By 2050, we would have overwhelming power to reverse generational theft completely. The victories would accumulate as demographics shifted. This timeline gave us strategic guidance. We knew which fights to prioritize at which times. We understood when we had enough power for which reforms. We could plan our campaigns based on realistic assessment of our growing strength. The generational war was open. Both sides understood the conflict. The fighting would intensify. The struggle would be long, but the outcome was certain. Youth would win. Old people would lose. The stolen wealth would be returned. Justice would prevail. Mathematics guaranteed everything. The openness of the conflict was actually advantageous for us. When the war was hidden, young people blamed themselves for their poverty. Now that the war was explicit, we understood we were victims of theft. The clarity made organizing easier and resistance stronger. Old people understood the conflict too. They recognized that young people were their enemies now. They knew we wanted to take back their stolen wealth. They saw that we would eventually have the power to do it. Their understanding made them fight harder to preserve their theft while they still could. The fighting was intensifying exactly as predicted. Old people were using every weapon to suppress youth resistance. They deployed police against protesters. They arrested movement leaders. They spread propaganda against us. They used their remaining power to crush us before demographics shifted against them. But their repression was failing because it couldn't change the fundamental mathematics. They could arrest individual activists, but they couldn't arrest an entire generation. They could suppress specific protests, but they couldn't stop the demographic tide. They could delay our victory, but they couldn't prevent it. We responded to their repression by becoming more radical and more determined. Every arrested activist created 10 more fighters. Every police attack generated 100 more supporters. Every propaganda lie convinced 1,000 more young people that the system was evil. Their violence proved we were right and strengthened our movement. The struggle would be long because old people had decades of life remaining. They wouldn't surrender their stolen wealth easily. They would fight desperately to preserve their robbery until they died. We needed to sustain resistance for 20 or 30 years until demographics delivered overwhelming victory. The length of the struggle required building sustainable movement structures. We couldn't rely on temporary enthusiasm or single charismatic leaders. We needed organizations that would function for decades. We needed training programs that would prepare multiple generations of activists. We needed resources that would sustain long-term resistance.